Good evening, everybody. I'm Clifford Shannon on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Welcome. It's nice to say good evening. We haven't had an evening program since all of this COVID stuff began. And we go back now to a bit, perhaps more of a normal schedule, but the occasion calls for it because we have a really interesting conversation tonight about some very interesting projects that we collaborated with the museum and Wondrium on a documentary film, a long form called Reporting 9/11 and Why It Still Matters, and a companion program that goes with it, Women Journalists of 9/11, Their Stories. Both of those programs feature extensive interviews with a large number of journalists. And I'll make the introduction to the panel in a moment, but I want to give you a sense of this documentary. So the first thing we're going to do is play a bit of a segment from it and the promotion of the film itself.
Phone rang and it was the NBC News desk saying, "We've got an issue here, we can't figure it out. A plane is said to hit the World Trade Center."
You can never go to work as a White House correspondent and not have some teeny part of your brain think to yourself, today could be a terrible day for the president. Today could be a terrible day for the country.
Looking at the president's face, it was clear from his expression something awful had just happened.
I bypassed everybody and went right to the control room and said, put me on the air. I'm here, and you need to know what I'm seeing.
You look up and then you see it. You can't comprehend it. How could this be happening? But then you have to snap out of that and you have to get to work. I thought that I was witnessing the death of 25,000 people.
Looking at people going in the opposite direction from where I was heading.
You knew the whole world was watching.
So as we all know, it's 20 years later, and there are so many ways to look at this, but certainly the impact of the work of journalists and the impact on journalists and journalism of that event is something that we're going to explore tonight. Let me introduce the panel. First, Rehema Ellis, an NBC News correspondent who reports across all NBC News and MSNBC platforms, including NBC Nightly News Today, MSNBC, and NBCnews.com. She joined NBC in 1994 as a general assignment correspondent, having begun her career at KDKA Radio and TV in Pittsburgh, and also later at WHDH TV in Boston. She has received numerous awards, including local and national Emmys, the Edward R. Murrow Award, Associated Press Awards, many others. She's a recipient of an honorary doctorate degree in journalism, and of course, covered 9/11 from the very beginning. Phil Hirschkorn, who is the director of the film Reporting 9/11 and Why It Still Matters, and is the founder of Real News Productions, covered 9/11, its aftermath for CNN, and that included the investigation of the attacks, the work of the 9/11 Commission, and the Victims' Compensation Fund. All of these things tied up together in that day itself. He produced the one-hour documentary CNN Presents 16 Acres and has continued to cover this subject extensively in its variety in the years since. Allison Gilbert is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, the author of numerous books. On 9/11, Allison was a television news producer here in New York. She was nearly killed by falling debris when the second tower collapsed. She was on the scene. She is, and thank you again, Allison, for doing this, the official narrator of the museum's historical exhibition audio tour, and she's the only female journalist to be so honored. And she is the executive producer of the two film projects that I mentioned earlier. And finally, Mitchell Stevens is a professor of journalism at New York University's Carter Institute. He's the author or co-author of 9 books, including A History of News, which has been translated into 5 languages. His latest book, The Voice of America, Lowell Thomas and the Invention of 20th Century Journalism, received the 2018 Sperber Prize. And Stevens, along with Allison Gilbert and Phil Hirschkorn, was one of the editors of a book covering catastrophe, Broadcast Journalist Report, September 11th, which I believe was at the origin of this project that now comes 20 years later. So we have a very distinguished panel tonight. And let me start by taking us back, all of you involved in the coverage of the day. There are so many levels to being there as a professional at that point. But there's a clip that I want to play that sort of captures a lot of this. The first is clip number 2, and it picks up something that Rehema was saying in the promo for the film. So let's look at that first. So this is, of course, the dilemma of having a responsibility in relation to this terrible event as it's unfolding. Rehema, pick up for us a little bit, if you would, that situation that you faced. We speak of it in relation to the firefighters and the first responders going in when everybody's coming out. But of course, you had that responsibility as well.
So thank you. I want to say thank you to the 9/11 Memorial Museum for putting this together and having us all here. It is something that was very much on my mind that day, that it is the firefighters, the first responders, police officers who are normally running into a catastrophic situation that 9/11 is all about. And often reporters are too. But I never imagined that I would be running into something like what we found at Ground Zero. And it was frightening, it was upsetting, it was life-altering in many ways. And just to see the clip that you played as an introduction to our discussion tonight, it makes me feel so much of the emotions that I felt that day. I just want to let people know that part of the job that I feel that I have as a journalist, and all of us have, is to go those places where other people don't go, can't go, maybe even shouldn't go. But that was probably the toughest time I ever felt, such a heavy responsibility of doing that job, going where nobody else wanted to go that day, except those first responders, and how brave and how courageous and how magnificent they were in doing their job that day. And I, again, just feel honored that I had an opportunity to be there, to watch them, to witness, to bear witness to what they did.
Allison, you too are on the scene. You too are facing the dilemma of mortal peril, and you're seeing, of course, death around you. The building comes down and you are there. Where is the balance between the professional responsibility that you feel and the natural instinct for self-preservation?
Well, I guess I should be very clear. For me, self-preservation at the moment of the second tower collapsing came first. I can't lie. I ran for my life. I ran out of my shoes. I dove for cover behind a police barricade that had been erected there for some reason that was not related to 9/11. And because it was the New York City mayoral primary day, I had like not a pocketbook, but I had a bag with me, and and it's relevant because I just put it over my head, thinking that that was going to somehow protect me from what was then falling on top of me and around me. And I can get into my story if you want, but ultimately I was put in an ambulance. Tags were put down around my chest for triage to go to the emergency room. I was taken to Bellevue here in New York City. And it wasn't until I was out of the ER, after the tubes that were placed down my throat were then taken out of my throat, when I was okay to breathe on my own, when I was finally taken to a room where patients, very few of them, right, we could talk about that too, that I was able to then pivot from being a patient, one of the lucky ones, to actually getting on the phone, calling into my newsroom, talking with the anchor on the air, and reporting live from my hospital bed.
Extraordinary. There's another clip I want to play that goes right to this point. It's clip number 6, where again, the impulse to do the job, and Phil, I'm going to ask you about that when we come out of this clip, but the impulse to do the job really takes extraordinary precedence at any possible moment. So let's see what that looks like. Now, Phil, I find that very moving, and it does speak to what drives people to do this, even in these dire circumstances. You must have seen so much of this and felt it as well in terms of what you did.
Sure, and that's Isolde Peguero, who worked for Telemundo, and it's interesting now the number of people who watch Telemundo and Univision and a more Spanish-speaking America is more than ever. But the moment that really captured my attention in that anecdote from her was something that happened to me, as she describes it. Our job was to get closer to the towers. You might have been close enough to see flying glass, things like that. But if you weren't that close, you might not have realized what the danger was, right? And certainly when Allison talks about Tower 2 collapsing, the second one hit being the first one to fall less than an hour after it was hit, nobody expected that. Nobody was prepared for that. So none of us really realized the extent of the danger. Like Isolde and her crew, I was with the CNN crew, and our job, as Rehema was saying, was to get closer. How close can we get? Not just to see what was happening, but to interview people who were coming out of the buildings. And most people did come out of the buildings, thankfully, in those 120 minutes that they had to do so. That was the challenge of the day. And again, when Isolde talks about getting to her live truck, that was all of our jobs, was to, get down there and go live, connect with your crew, connect with your truck, and do what we certainly did at CNN, and then the other networks were breaking in, go live, continuous coverage. But that proved impossible in those cases. If you had a microwave truck, your receive antenna was at the top of the World Trade Center. So that wasn't going to work. There weren't as many satellite trucks in those days, and they certainly weren't deployed as quickly. So it was a real challenge. And I think the choices we had to make in a situation where situational awareness was terrible. None of us knew what else was going on in the other cities. Police radios were crackling with rumors and misinformation. We didn't have, smartphones. We didn't have headlines. We didn't have texts. We didn't have the internet. So all we could know is what was right in front of us and what we could see. And so in my case, in many people's cases, we just decided to document. We'll be a tape crew, and we'll figure out how to get the video on TV later. And that's what a lot of us ended up doing, Cliff.
Mitch, this sounds to me like war correspondence. And, it didn't start out that way. It started out as an primary election in New York City. And then nobody quite knew what that first plane was until the second plane hit. But, is there a difference in reporting that you see in retrospect that came out of 9/11, or does it fit into a pre-existing mold of how journalists cover these kinds of situations?
Well, it was moving how many journalists did what my three fellow panelists here did. They went towards this story, and there are dozens of stories like this of journalists going to get it, not because they wanted to be famous, not because there was some money in it for them, because that's what they did. And we don't often see that side of journalists. We're so busy attacking them for being too partisan or not partisan enough. But these are, I don't want to compare their bravery to that of the first responders who were going up the Trade Center towers, many of whom lost their lives. But I think we did see the good side of journalism, and we see it in war coverage, where quite a few journalists have been killed covering wars, including recent wars in World War II, certainly in the Civil War, and I think it's a good way reminding ourselves that for all its flaws and all the things that get us annoyed, it's a noble profession, telling people what's going on in the world.
You know, the cliche is that journalism's first draft of history. And I wonder, for those of you who were covering this, did you have an awareness that the world was changing right in front of your eyes in the midst of all of this chaos and catastrophe? Was that something you were aware of, or really it's just a matter of keeping your eye on the ball and just getting whatever you could get? And as Phil said, put those pieces together later. Rehema, is there a dual quality to your experience of that day?
Absolutely, for me, because it was so huge. The World Trade Towers represented part of the New York landscape. If you come into New York, you would see those towers. And for those towers to come down, you knew that this was historic, and what brought them down was historic. So in the midst of knowing that there is a story that has to be covered, there is a tragedy that's unfolding. At the same time, I was aware, but what I did not know was the whole scope of it. As was mentioned by Phil and by Mitch, in some measure of covering a war, you only see your little bit, your little piece of it, and you have to document what you can in that moment. Not think so much about what else is going on because you don't have a way of being aware of it, but just document what's happening. I've never covered a war, so I don't know what that experience is like, but I can only imagine that it has to be somewhat similar in the sense of the terror that you're experiencing in the moment, in the little place that you are, and wondering about the enormity of the impact it's going to have on a larger scale. Both of those things were going through my mind that day.
You know, Phil, let me come to you. Was it important that you had a bigger picture, or because you couldn't have a big picture, you just put that out of your mind and tried to gather what you could?
Oh, definitely the latter. I mean, we were sort of helpless, and all you could do was talk to people who were right in front of you, video what was right in front of you, and we tried to do that. And then, of course, it was, you know, a challenge to even get that video on the air because everything as the day went on was live. And so to sort of break in with your video, and I know I had a lot of video that wasn't seen until much, much later. And so, you know, that was a challenge for sure. I would also say that none of us really had experience covering terrorism attacks. I mean, there had been the 1993 bombing on the World Trade Center, which some New York press people had covered, including those that are in our film. I wasn't one of them. There was, of course, the 1995 attack by domestic terrorists in Oklahoma City. But most people didn't have that much knowledge of Al-Qaeda. As John Miller says in our film, if you pulled over 300 people on the street on September 10th and asked them who Osama bin Laden was, 300 people would not know the answer. Of course, he did, because he was one of the two people, along with Peter Bergen, who had actually interviewed bin Laden for their jobs prior to 9/11. I mean, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center, all throughout 2001, was a trial, which I happened to cover, about the embassy bombings in Africa. A lot of people didn't really know or had forgotten that in 1998, Al-Qaeda used truck bombs and attacked American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and killed more than 200 people, including more than a dozen Americans. And that trial went almost right up till September, where the 4 people convicted were sentenced. That got some attention, but I would not say that that was, you know, generally known among the masses of Americans. So just a terrorist attack on our soil was new for most of us. And of course, the sort of surprise attack, the reference point that everyone has is of course Pearl Harbor, and that was, you know, decades earlier.
Allison, you know, confusion really seems to be part of the story as it's unfolding, and confusion is part of the reporting at that time, at least, you know, as I remember it. And yet, you know, the media is supposed to provide the bigger picture. In this case, nobody had the bigger picture. How, you know, were you orienting what you were trying to communicate around this idea that we didn't know what was happening?
I think I will echo the earlier thoughts that I was taken from Ground Zero. I was on West and Vesey Street by ambulance to Bellevue Hospital. From that vantage point, of course, I was able to see what the emergency room was looking like, how not busy it was, talking to the doctors, where are the other patients? And in a very odd experience, watching their TV coverage in the hospital of where I had just been taken from. It's almost like watching your life where you just were, but now you are in a building that felt, at least at that moment, safer. You didn't know what was coming next. So even though I was now, blocks and blocks from Ground Zero, I still was unnerved by my surroundings because we didn't know if even the hospital was safe. And so I stuck with what I saw, and I stuck with what I could then see when I was reporting live from my hospital bed on the phone to the anchor of WNBC, which is the local NBC station here in New York.
Mitch, when we talk about this event at the museum, we say as many as a third of the world population at the time watched it in real time. And so there was this common participation and witness to an event that, in fact, drives people around the world to come to the museum and to recognize the significance of that day 20 years ago. But that's a very, very different kind of event and kind of media coverage of an event where there's no interpretation. There is everybody seeing this at the same time. And the viewer is as informed as the network anchor is, because where is the context and how is it going to be provided? That strikes me as a turning point in a world historical event happening in real time in front of everybody's eyes. Am I overstating that, or is that something that does change what the media landscape becomes?
Well, it was something that most of us never experienced before. It's important to remember, if I can give a little historical perspective here, that for most of human history, people didn't know what was going on. You'd wait weeks in the United States for the ships to come in to tell you what was happening with Napoleon in Europe, or it would take a week for news from Washington to reach New York, and you didn't know when wars ended and what your leaders were doing. And this was kind of a throwback to that event, because for the first time in my lifetime, we didn't know what was happening. It took a while for us to realize that the United States of America had just been attacked. The United States, the country that seemed the strongest in the world, and in which my generation was lucky enough to never have seen attacked. And gradually, through the good work of these journalists, the picture began to come into focus, and we started to learn what was happening. And I think it was a milestone in the history of television journalism in particular. It was, in many ways, the biggest story television in the United States had ever covered. The only competition maybe being the Kennedy assassination. And, talking in this way, I don't want to diminish what a tragedy it was, what a terrible, terrible tragedy it was for so many people. But, it was a television story. The newspapers didn't come out for a long time afterwards. I was home watching this, not covering it like some of you on the panel. And I remember picking up my son from school, and he immediately ran to the internet, to his computer. And then pretty soon he was with me watching television, because the internet went down. The internet wasn't mature enough, wasn't developed enough to cover this story. But TV did, and TV is what kept us informed. And TV was what enabled us to bring this incredible, incomprehensible event into some focus.
Rehema, you have, we were talking before, been reporting on 9/11 related stories, as Phil has as well, for these past 20 years. And I wonder, this is a strange way to put it perhaps, but what is the point? How do you see the value of going back to this on an annual or a regular basis? Is the story the same as you go back to the anniversary of 9/11 each year? How is it filtered through other changes and other motions in time that have happened in the interim?
I think it's absolutely essential that we go back year after year after year. It just strikes me that we have a generation now, including my son, who was not born at the time of 9/11. He has no living memory of what happened that day. And this happened to us as a nation. And if we as a nation don't remember, it just saddens me to think that the time would come that this would not be a part of our collective memory or collective remembrance. That's why it's so important to go back. Does it change? Not really. The pain is really very strong every single year, including just a few weeks ago when I was down at Ground Zero. The sense of loss is palpable. You can feel it. It embraces you. But the one thing I can say that I do think is different, there's this sense of resolve that I noticed in people. There's the ability to smile. There's the ability to remember with laughter and just this twinkle in their eyes, their loved ones. And the appreciation that we as journalists and that the nation has decided that we will never forget, that we will remember. They are making it their mission to remember for all of their lives. How could they possibly forget? For myself as a journalist, I feel honored to be given this and to also volunteer to cover 9/11 every single year. It's an honor. What happened? I just think, forgive me, because I'm supposed to be this journalist who is objective and maybe in some measure unfeeling, but I'm not unfeeling about this. And the reason is because it happened in my backyard. I live in New York. I wasn't just covering a story that I got on a plane and I flew to some distant country and reported on. I reported on a story that happened just down the street from where I was living. And it was painful. And that's not to say that I've not felt the painful loss of others in other countries when I've been overseas reporting on tragic events. It's not to say that. But there's something about it when it happens in your house, when your own house burns, when your own house, you lose everything in the house. And what we lost that day, we lost people in our house. So to answer your question, it's in some ways it's the same. In some ways, I don't think it ever could be different, but there is something that's happening where people are recognizing and appreciating those who come every year to remember their loved ones. They appreciate that we are there and remembering with them, Phil.
Allison, this idea that you're a journalist and you have this responsibility, but the pain that you might have experienced that Rehema, explains in her personal case, I imagine having been hospitalized, you have some very strong memories of what happened that day. How does that need to be managed in relation to reporting these events? You're not, as a reporter, there just to tell a personal story as the extent of what happened, and yet it gives an authenticity to what you're telling. If, as Rehema just did, it brackets what the reporting is. How is that balanced in the work that reporters do?
Well, I think it's a really personal question. Every individual who's a journalist has to wrestle with what they saw and what they felt, and in many cases, down at Ground Zero, what they tasted and what they smelled in the air. For me, it was recommended to me that I go see a post-traumatic stress syndrome, a PTSD therapist. It was something, from my recollection, that NBC was very proactive, allowing employees to take advantage of, and I took it. And one of the greatest exercises that we did together gave birth to the book that in turn gave rise to the documentary and the 20-part series. And it was this. It was to write down everything that I had been experiencing and fearing or ruminating over. The thought being that I'm sorry to be so graphic, but just as someone would vomit from eating something that disagreed with them, and then they feel better, the idea was, if you committed to paper what was making me so uncomfortable, that was causing me to have PTSD symptoms, I would then be purging that from me and allow myself to move forward in a similar way. It worked. It was very helpful to me. And in so doing, from this experience, I reached out to colleagues of mine, friends of mine, Phil Hirschkorn included, to say, hey, we need to offer this similar opportunity to our colleagues, other reporters, other journalists, but also cameramen, producers, in front of the camera, behind the scenes. Let's all collectively express what we all saw, because normally reporters don't, right? There was a before 9/11 where we kept things inside. And I really think there is a dividing line between a pre 9/11 feeling that you keep these emotions very close, and a post 9/11 where reporters and anchors are much more frequently expressing how they feel. And that is the origin story of Covering Catastrophe, the book. And it's really, I think, why the documentary and the series are so evocative, because this is personal.
You know, Phil, the film itself certainly captures the emotionality that many of the journalists that you all interviewed obviously still feel. It would appear to me that that's just a very widespread feeling among anybody who was covering that event. It seems to stand apart in significant ways from other things that they might have done before or now after in their careers.
Absolutely. And as Scott Pelley talked about in that first clip, and others do in the film, you know, we all witnessed the death of thousands of people. We weren't sure how many that day. And quite frankly, it took the work of the 9/11 Commission 3 years later for all of us as a country to get the timeline right, to get a lot of the facts right. But I think that's why journalists who were there felt it so strongly and still feel it. I think a lot of the participants still feel it, as Allison was talking about, and Rehema, about the guilt and the remembrance, all those emotions that get caught up in every anniversary. Now, I live in Portland, Maine now, and a lot of people forget the attacks, in a way, started here because Muhammad Atta and one of his muscle hijackers boarded an early flight here, 6 a.m., to catch the flight from Boston, which they crashed into the Trade Center. I spoke to the ticket agent who checked him in. And boy, he's still working through that. You know, years of therapy. Allison talked about PTSD. I remember when I worked at CNN, when we were doing early stories, and somehow I learned of the travel agent office in, I believe it was Newark, or maybe it was Paterson, New Jersey, where some of the hijackers lived. And she had sold the Flight 93 hijackers, or at least a couple of them, in cash, their tickets. She started crying. Of course, I never put her on camera, wouldn't do that to her, but just my approaching her and discussing it with her. And I'm sure she and many others who had interactions with the hijackers and the gyms and in all these other places that they frequented are still working it out 20 years later. The other thing I would say is, beyond the remembrance, which is so important, we do every year, which the museum stands for, the story's still going on, Cliff. Right? That's why it still matters. I mean, I was making a short list, if you saw me looking down, 9/11 Justice, still going on. We have 5 knuckleheads in Guantanamo who still haven't seen a trial. We did have one trial in this country. That was more than 15 years ago, the Moussaoui trial in Virginia, only one for the 9/11 conspiracy. National security, aviation security, these things are still evolving in front of us. The war in Afghanistan, which kind of just ended a month ago in a very dramatic way. A lot of our contributors talk about that. A lot of journalists covered that and are still in the news. So a lot of these things are still ongoing, which is why I think 20 years on, we have to still covering it. And finally, the World Trade Center illness. A lot of our people talk about the air quality. Again, in the early days, very few people had a true understanding of what that was about. And the first responders and construction workers and journalists and residents all breathed in that air for months. And as Sean Adams, who himself got cancer related to the World Trade Center, a WCBS radio reporter, says in the film, more people, when this is all said and done, will probably have died from that than were killed on the attacks whose names are inscribed in the memorial. It's astonishing. So it's still going on. The story has not ended.
Mitch, we talk about the emotionality of this as an influence on the reporting. Obviously, the people who are reporting are people, and they are affected deeply by what they have experienced and what they have seen. Does that pose challenges for, I realize objectivity is a highly contested term in journalism nowadays, but does it compromise something? Does it enhance something in terms of their voice being so much a product of that day's experience?
Well, in rereading some of the stories in covering catastrophe, our collection of our account of the day in the words of the broadcast journalists who covered it, I'm struck by how they had about how clear a sense they had of what their role was. And their role was to see and tell what they were seeing, sometimes with video, sometimes with audio, but often just by being there and describing what they were seeing and describing what they were feeling. And no, that isn't, I mean, it's a good point. That's not straight objectivity, stand back, I'm a scientist examining things. They were there to give human reactions to what's going on. And I think some of the great journalism in history has done that. I think of John Hersey reporting on Hiroshima, for example, great war reporting. It was often feeling reporting. It often was moving reporting, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Rehema, does that feel different in terms of your journalistic life? That, I mean, the way you spoke about it before, it obviously affected you greatly. I can only imagine that it informs or colors in some way the depth of the reporting that you do on this. I think it probably strengthens it, but the point is, are you aware of this as a different stance than you might otherwise take on different stories?
Without a doubt. And I think that that brings power. I think it brings meaning. I think it brings depth to my reporting. It's not the same, but you recall the reporting of when the Hindenburg exploded, and just the announcer on radio, his voice was filled with emotion. He was breaking at seeing that blimp just go up in a ball of flames. He could not control himself, and you felt it. And to me, that's what the reporting was all about. We go into places so people can see, hear, hopefully feel as they try to understand. And I understood what was happening when that blimp exploded. I hope that people got a sense of understanding of what was happening at Ground Zero and at the Pentagon and in Shanksville as we tell those stories. I was in Mississippi recently and talking with some high school students about learning about 9/11, and they were shown some clips of what occurred that day. These students had never seen it. And you could see them and their eyes start to well up with tears. And afterwards, and I asked them, what do you think about what you saw? And they said, I never knew. I knew that there was 9/11, but I never knew that we were talking about so many real people. Our job is to tell you that, as we've said many times, people lost folks they loved and who loved them, real people. And if anything in our reporting can transmit the need to be vigilant, the need to be aware. Pearl Harbor taught us that. Maybe we forgot it for a little bit, so many decades ago. And these students said to me, they were pleased and they were grateful that the stories could be shared about what happened, because suddenly they had a sense of how important it is and how 9/11, as you point out, Phil, has affected their lives. They're only 16, 17, 18. They can't get on a plane without taking off their shoes. They can't go onto a plane without going through a security system and metal detectors. Some of those things came as a result of 9/11. And so, did they know that? No. So that's why the reporting is so important, that we tell it, not just on 9/11. I think we have to be mindful of it in classes all the time. And it's something that we're having a hard time doing. In this particular place where I was, when I asked the teacher, how much do they talk about 9/11 in her lessons? She says, not very much. They do a whole chapter, maybe 10, 11, 12 pages on Vietnam. How much on 9/11? 1 page and a half. A page and a half. That's all those students get. And in part, it's because of what you said, Phil, 9/11 is still happening. The consequences of it are still unfolding. And so I think if we have some emotion that's connected with this, and if it allows people to feel that this story is real, this is not something in some distant history that you can be disconnected from. You're very connected to it right here and right now.
By the way, Rehema, you've also described the mission of the museum as well as the mission of journalistic reporting on this. But I want to, since we were saying before that in the reporting of this, there was no context, and, the few people who might have thought Al-Qaeda were not on the air immediately and all that kind of thing. But, the essence of it, in fact, is the emotion. If it is stripped away and you do not have a political sense of this, which emerged later, but if you're simply on the scene and watching this happen, then the depth of reporting has got to be emotion, because that's the nature of what the human experience of that was. So, Allison, I think, the story you tell and the way of connecting professional journalists, not just around their professional responsibilities, but the depth of what they felt and how that informed their reporting. I think that strikes me as a very important aspect of the projects that you and Phil have launched here.
I think that journalists are relieved to be able to have participated, and I can't speak for everyone's reasons for wanting to be a part of these dual film projects. I think there is an element of catharsis when you're able to come to work as a whole person. So you're a journalist, yes. You're still human. In many cases, you might be a father to, or also a mother. You're certainly a son and a daughter. And by giving voice to a complete experience, you can be a professional and also have feelings, and layered on top of that, still, as Rehema did, run south, run towards what was unfolding, as we did. And I feel like by giving voice to this complete experience, it gives a more full picture of what it means to be a journalist, to compartmentalize when you have to, and to keep plowing forward, because there are moving deadlines where you do need to inform. The information will evolve. The information will improve as the day unfolds, but you take it one micro moment at a time. And then in between those live shots, you're calling to make sure that your family is okay. And I feel like giving voice to that dual experience of being a person at work and at the same time, a person with a family has really shifted in many ways. I write a lot about grief and loss and resilience since 9/11. That's been my primary focus. And it allows us to have a fuller, more complete picture of those people who we need to interview.
Let me turn to our audience. I have a question here. And if you have a question you'd like to submit, put it through the chat box on the app and we will get it. William Raff and Phil, I'll turn this to you first, but this is really for everybody. What lessons learned on 9/11 affected television reporting, and how has that changed TV reporting in general?
Well, I think the main lesson learned is back to basics, stripping away all of these tools that we have because we didn't have them on 9/11. I know you had a clip queued up of this, but I'm gonna steal your thunder and just say what the clip said. This is Byron Pitts in our film talks about what he calls the KISS principle. Some other people may have heard of that. I hadn't heard of that. I thought he was talking about the rock band from the 70s. Keep it simple, stupid. And that's an example of going back to basics, as Byron says he did in order to A, get the job done, and B, as Allison was just talking about, to cope with all the emotions and the horrible images and which he filmed and he wrote to later that day, people jumping from the buildings, which we haven't talked about yet. I mean, horrific things that were going on, and just learning to have that tunnel vision. I think those are some of the key lessons of 9/11. We've talked about it being like war correspondents. And in fact, this was the first attack in the war, that wars that began after 9/11 because of 9/11. And I remember at CNN, Peter Arnett used to also talk about covering Vietnam, previously our longest war. And his rule when he worked for the AP and later at CNN was just, what do I know? What can I see in front of me that I know I can confirm without anybody else's help, and stick to that? I think that was a big lesson that came out of 9/11, especially when we were somewhat handicapped. As I say, and as Mitch was saying, TV reporters who didn't have cameras or became phone reporters or sort of radio reporters, for example. That was many of us. So I just think people had to go back to their basics and their intuition and confirming and reporting what was right in front of them.
Mitch, your thoughts on lessons learned?
You know, it's interesting. If this were to happen today, it would have happened in a very different world. We would have, presumably the cell phones would have kept working. They did not in Manhattan on September 11th. Presumably the internet would have stood up to the traffic, I would hope. There would have been all these people with cameras taking pictures of everything. It would have played against this this divisive view we have of the media, which we like one channel, we don't like the other channel, we don't trust them, they're too tough, they're not tough enough, and so on. And that wasn't really there then. And this is, you know, this is a lesson in the most important function of journalism, and a reminder of what the most important function of journalism is, which is to tell people what's going on, and to tell people what's going on when it's most important, when it's most crucial. And I think, you know, it's been a while since 9/11, and we're talking about remembering, but I think journalism needs to remember that too.
Rehema, a lesson or two that you have pulled from this?
I would echo what's been said. I've often thought about how an event like 9/11 would be covered today, 20 years later. Mitch, all of what you mentioned of the access that we have to document things. We have it in our pocketbooks now, or in our wallets, and I don't know. I often wonder if the citizen journalist, if you will, who has this device would have stood as steadfast as those of us who do this for a living stood that day, or if they would have run, which is what would be expected of them to do. But running all the while taking a picture as they're fleeing. And how many of those images would we have been able to put on the air in that moment? And God forbid it should ever happen again. But I do think that it's so important, Phil, what you mentioned and what Byron Pitts has said about keeping it simple, because that's what I did that day. I literally just reported on what I saw, what was in front of me, folks whom I talked to. I didn't have that view from 30,000 feet up to give perspective and context to what I was seeing. I could only report on what was there. And I think in some measure, even today, it's important that we remember that so many times in doing our stories. Tell me what you see here, what's happening. And then sometimes maybe our anchors, and when we have an opportunity to do a story in a longer format, we can broaden it out and give more context to it. But there are still some stories where you need to just report on what you are seeing in the moment, because God knows that's what people want to know. What's happening right here, right now.
Let me, Phil,
can I just jump in and add, I just want to add one more thing, because I think speaks to what Rehema is saying. I think the reporting 9/11 showed what a calling journalism is for those of us that do this as a career and have done it for so long. People like Rehema, she slept in her car I don't even know if you would call it sleep. She shut her eyes for a few minutes and then started again on September 12th. People who were in Shanksville, who were in our film, talk about sleeping in their satellite truck. No, it's partly because they were in the middle of nowhere and had nowhere to go, but they didn't want to miss a moment. And they wore the same clothes for a week and went right back to try to figure out what happened to Flight 93. So I really think that 9/11 showed what a calling journalism is and was, at a time when journalists are sometimes not, like our government, not as trusted as much as they used to be. Maybe they should get more credit.
Let me ask that. And Allison, this is for everybody, but start with you. I mean, 9/11 happens today, 20 years later. And of course, counterfactual is problematic because all the consequences of 9/11 had led us to today. But just give me that for the sake of this question. Is it covered the same way? Is it perceived by the public the same way? Is the divisiveness that we all live with going to somehow divide us in terms of what we see or what we understand about that event, do you think?
I think, of course, it's not an easy answer. At one side, you would have so many more sources of video if people didn't run away, as Rehema was just talking about. You will have more sources of video or sound, but in many cases, you will have fewer gatekeepers, those editors who then make the call of what people see, what has been vetted, what's actually real, what's been in these days altered in some way. So I do feel you'll have more, but then my concern would be who is actually managing that content. So what you see as a consumer of journalism is something that you can feel is trustworthy. And that's when the folding of so many local newspapers around the country is actually very concerning, because you need a counterpunch to the grandness of what our phones give us, right? The breadth. I think what we need to rely upon is also depth, and that comes of being a seasoned journalist. And we haven't spoken about that. We are all here individually, but TV is just about the best team sport profession there is, and people work in tandem or else TV won't get on the air. And I feel like that is something that remains. That is something where people work in a newsroom and they could make ethical decisions, moral decisions together, and nothing is done inside a newsroom unilaterally, which I think is actually really important to talk about when a device is something that can be done solo and cause damage.
Mitch, 20 years later, if this happens, are we so divided that even the images then become grist for different mills?
Well, we've seen that with the tragedy we've been undergoing in the last couple of years, the pandemic. It certainly has been divisive. It would be really sad to think that if an event like this, well, maybe it's sad if an event like this happened again, but that if an event like this were covered on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, whether it would get lost in anger and partisan bickering. There was something to be said for the world in which it did happen, the world of the three network anchors, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, who were reasonably trusted by large numbers of Americans. My students don't even know these names now, and I don't think they could tell you the name of the anchors on the three networks right now. But they were a calming force. They made their mistakes like everybody did, trying to sort the information coming in. But I think we trusted them and they calmed us. And, I'm not somebody that bashes social media all the time. I get a lot of news from Twitter myself. But I fear that if something like this happened, we'd be a little worse off because these unifying forces in the country have gone to some extent.
Emma, you're out there.
That too. If I could just jump in for a quick second, Cliff. I worry about the ethical imperative that I feel in doing a story. I've mentioned that I feel 9/11 personally. It hits me and it just punches me in the gut. But at the same time, I am a journalist. I really do take that to heart. It is a tremendous responsibility that I don't have an objective when I go and report on a story. I don't. My only objective, if I were to have one, is to tell the story. It's not what can I get out of it? What will it mean to this person or that person? Is there some singular entity that's going to benefit versus the whole of us? That's not what I do. And to Mitch's point, it worries me a little bit because we are so divided as a country that, again, God forbid that something like this were to happen of this magnitude. How would all of these images be interpreted and how might they be used, if for the common good or for some individual pursuit? It's a concern.
Yeah, no, frankly, it's not just speculative when you think about the images of COVID and everything else and how those are not interpreted in any single way across the country. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I did want to urge all of you to look at Wondrium as the documentary film reporting 9/11 and why it still matters, as well as the long-form series of interviews, women journalists of 9/11, their stories. As I've come to do at the end of these programs, so much of what we talk about is really the basis, the core of the museum's mission. It is what we are here for. And so I ask those of you out in the audience who may not have come to us before, may not have joined as a member or contributed to the museum, to consider supporting these programs in this context at neverforget.org. And with that, let me take a moment to thank Rehema Ellis, Phil Hirschkorn, Allison Gilbert, Mitchell Stevens, on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. I'm Clifford Shannon. Good night.